Many of Scotland's landscapes are beautiful and dramatic, but they're also quite unnatural. We've lost most of our native woodlands, and with them, the plants and animals that would have lived there. Sheep and deer have grazed our hillsides to the roots, but if you know where to look, you can see small remnants of what could flourish again. The Ardvar woodlands in Sutherland are a great example. They form part of the most northerly oak woods in the British Isles. They're designated as a site of special scientific interest, and also as a special area of conservation. This gives them the highest level of protection under European law, which shows just how special they are. But despite this, the Ardvar woodlands are dying. And sadly, this is typical of many woodlands across Scotland.
Woodland is, if you like, the climax habitat for most of Scotland, or large chunks of the Highlands and large chunks of Scotland. And it would have been a really diverse thing. So from the montane scrub, from the dwarf birch and the juniper right on the summits, right down to the oaks and all these different species you get in the rich lowlands. And throughout that wide range of habitat, of woodland habitats, there's all the animals and insects and birds associated with it. And it's a huge complex web that's kind of been destroyed. And so we've lost a lot of the animals and the interactions that would have existed in that native woodland.
Here on the south side of Coonaig, which has got aspen, holly, rowan, hazel, birch, willow, a whole load of things here, but it's a tiny little fragment. And I mean, people driving past here in their car wouldn't think there was a woodland growing up here. But there's trees all along the cliffs here, just hanging on. And it could be a seed source. This could come away quite quickly if deer numbers were reduced. This would have been thick with trees in the past, and they've all gone, and people don't seem to realise that that is the case. So we have actually lost our rainforest, but we could do something to get at least some of it back.
It's not that we don't have regeneration here, we have regeneration, but it gets above the dominant vegetation. When it gets its head above, it gets nipped off, and you'll see abundant evidence of that. The majority of Coonaig is open moorland and hillland, and deer will have a more diffuse impact on all that ground, whereas our trees are constricted to a much smaller space. And it'll take a smaller number of deer to have a much bigger impact on trees. So effectively in woodland, you do need to have a lower density of deer to get your regeneration.
Part of our monitoring programme is we go back and we measure the same seedling every year. So we're seeing trees which could be, well, I know of one for a fact, which is at least 8 years old, and it's that big. You know, a little seedling like that should grow at least 10 centimetres every year, and it's just not happening.
Since deer counting began in the 1960s, the deer population has only really gone in one direction. It's just been increasing, and it's gone from an estimate of 150,000 to well over 400,000 today. But in terms of deer culling, it's remained pretty steady over the last few years. It hasn't really matched the increase in the population, and that's why the population has been growing, because annually less deer are culled than are born into the population.
I have a helicopter deer count taken over 20 years ago for Capeside and Kinlochbervie, and deer numbers have gone up several 100% since then.
You know, the fact is, when they are counted, they are showing an increase. I think perhaps part of the problem is that when people say deer numbers are going down, it's specific deer. It's the specific deer that are of interest to sporting estates, like the bigger stags. So it's a certain type of deer, if you like, that they feel the numbers are going down on, because, you know, our stalking, we don't target a deer because it's got a huge head or anything like that. You know, if it's in the wrong place, then we will shoot it. And we're criticised for that because sporting estates feel we ought to leave the bigger stags for them. But a deer in the wrong place eating the trees is doing the damage, so it's difficult to avoid that.
I mean, the old people will tell you if they want to go out and get a deer for the pot, they'd have to go right onto the Cape, or they'd have to go over towards Funyvin, miles away before they'd get one.
Deer numbers have increased year on year because we don't have the predators that used to not only eat them but also move them around. So they don't have wolves or lynx disturbing them. So they can stay in one spot and really concentrate their grazing there.
Man has taken over the role of the wolf and is the only predator now left of deer in Scotland. The large predators are a really key part that are missing. So for example, in Yellowstone they've brought back wolves, and the elk, which are very similar to red deer, have no longer settled in these particular valleys, and aspen and other trees have regenerated. They've created, if you like, a climate of fear. That's what they talk about. And I think that's kind of what's missing here. The other funny thing about hunting at the moment, or deer stalking in Scotland, is it very much focuses on a very short window. So most of the activity, particularly as around the stags, happens in a couple of weeks in October. And then the deer are left undisturbed for the rest of the time. And that doesn't really mimic a natural situation. I mean, predators don't have a season where they hunt things and leave them for the rest of the year. So because of that, the deer are basically grazing and impacting all the time in the woodland.
The solution, and because they don't have predators anymore, is to try and replicate that as best you can. And, you know, actually disturb the deer a little bit. Not all the time, but just in certain places where, you know, regeneration is key, like on Ardvar woodlands. We could do a lot of disturbance of the deer out with the stalking season, which would mean applying for an out-of-season licence. Again, people get very upset about that because they think we just want to shoot all the deer all the year round. But it's not, it's just actually disturbing a deer in a very small area.
In the absence of natural predators, the only two ways really to manage deer in Scotland is either to fence them or to cull them. And the deer fencing really only treats the symptoms, not the cause. And it creates a whole range of issues. So it creates an artificial area with no deer inside, and that has impacts on the biodiversity and the animals that would be used to those deer being in the woodland. But it also creates a pretty intrusive visual imposition as well. And once the fence is finished, eventually it falls down after 20 years. All that happens is the deer just pour back into where it was, where you've had them excluded. So it doesn't really change, it doesn't really tackle the main problem. And in the meantime, you're actually increasing the numbers of deer outside the fence. So if you like, you're concentrating the problem somewhere else. You're just passing the problem on to somewhere else.
In a landscape like this, you know, it would just look horrible because it really is. There's not an awful lot of fencing here, and it's lovely and open, and it would be a shame to remove that. You disturb their natural roots as well, and also it affects, you know, you can get bird strike, and also sometimes in the winter, if the deer get desperate enough, they will try and jump in. And very often, you know, you'll find a deer hung up by a back leg, and that's a really horrible thing to find.
The valuation of hunting or sporting estates in this country is based partly on the average number of sporting stags they shoot in a year. So there's a real incentive on a landowner to try and have as many sporting stags as possible, because that will add the value to his or her estate. They're not really valued on the amount of native woodland or the number of native species or the ecological processes that are happening. And it's just part of how we don't really value nature. We just take things for granted. If you're to value an estate on the amount of carbon it was sequestering, or the flood prevention it was providing, or the food products, or the timber, or the biodiversity, you'd probably come up with a very different value. Just by valuing it on the number of a particular species that you shoot and how many you have of that isn't necessarily the best thing for the environment.
Well, there is this perception that we want to shoot all the deer, but that's not the case at all, because they belong in the landscape. And if you reduce the population, there's more food for them, there's more shelter for them. If you reduce deer numbers, you get more viable stag calves, and that's actually what the sporting estates want.
The native deer are a fantastic animal that are part of our woodland complex, but they need to be at much lower numbers. And we just think that if you had a system in Scotland where you took both the public and the private objectives into account, and you worked out what population you needed, and you regulated that and enforced that, you'd end up with a much more sustainable system of deer management.
That's not saying we want to eradicate deer, because we don't. Deer are part of the ecosystem. They have a dynamic effect by what they do, but by their browsing, but also by the tracking, which disturbs ground. And when they browse the underlayers, that means the trees can get away. So you need deer in these woods too. And it's only right that they should be there, because they've always been here.